Before I start today's tutorial, I want to announce that I've made another Skillshare class. In this class, I will talk about some basic techniques on how to understand the flow of watercolors. I'll cover how to create different edges using the wet on wet as well as the wet on dry techniques in order to know when to control and when to let go with watercolors and to expect what certain things are going to look like when things dry quicker than we might intend them to. I'm also going to share the differences between papers and apply the techniques into a painting using both the cold pressed and hot pressed paper. All this is divided into shorter lessons so you can take breaks in between and pick up where you've left off. I tried to explain in great depth as these are some of the things I struggled with when I first started with watercolors, so I hope you'll find this class useful. If you've never been a member on Skillshare, you can go to the link in my description box for a free trial where you can have access to all the classes on Skillshare, including all of my classes that I've made so far on the platform. So join me if you're interested, and let's move on to this week's tutorial. Hi everyone, this is Nia, and today I'm going to paint these layered flowers using one of the techniques that I mentioned in my class. This is just one exercise that you can do with it, and I'm going to start by sketching out the shapes so it's a bit easier for us to visualize as we paint later. For the flowers, I like to start by painting some short lines fanning outwards, and for this I'm going to use a really thick consistency of the chosen color that you want your flowers to be, and I also want the paint to puddle up slightly so I can use it to pull and extend the color to the petals. As for the petals, I like to paint around 3 or 4 petals per flower to start off with, and I'm only going to use clean water or a really thin consistency of the same color that it almost looks like just tinted water. With this, I like to pull the really thick consistency paint from the center outwards in order to create the flower petals. Sometimes if I feel like I don't have enough pigment from the center, I like to also add in some dots for extra color that I can pull for the petals as well. For the petals, I want them to come out from the center, and for this area I try my best to paint them thinly and then enlarge the size as I get to the top of the petals. I also like to play with the shape. Sometimes I make the top of the petals slightly uneven to give it an organic look, and sometimes I like to also give them a slight bend so it looks like the wind is blowing and the petals are slightly moving. If there's enough space, you can also add 4 petals instead of 3 like this one. As you can see, I added a thin one on the side to give the impression that we can only see the side of this petal. After the 3 or 4 petals for the base, I want everything to dry before adding the extra overlap petals, and I'm going to paint them the same way in terms of the shape. But for these ones, I'm going to straight up just use a thin consistency of the color, which I'll explain later as I paint. I like to also play with the tilt of the flower, so make sure you're comfortable with drawing them out first and repeat it as many times as you would like before we move on to painting them freehand. As for the stem, I just make sure it comes out from the center of the flower and I create these long leaves. I try to vary the length and I try to make them look a little bit wavy sometimes, like it's swaying in the wind, and I'm also going to add some which are slightly drooping or folded. As I mentioned, feel free to just draw as many of these as you would like until you're comfortable painting them freehand. Next, let's go through the colors. Firstly, I'm going to use this Cobalt Turquoise by Schmincke, which I already have on my palette. Then next, I'm going to use Crimson Lake by Holbein and Aquarius Green by Szmal. Okay, let's begin to paint. Sorry, I've actually started, but I didn't realize it wasn't being recorded, but that's okay because this is going to be quite repetitive since we're going to repeat the same techniques. So I'm starting here from the center of the flower. For this, I'm using a mix of Crimson Lake and the Cobalt Turquoise. This is the main mixture that I'm going to use for all of the flowers. And as you can see, the paint is very thick, and I also tried to make it somewhat puddle up, so I have a lot of pigment to pull. To pull the pigment, I just loaded my brush with a lot of water. By the way, I'm just using a synthetic brush here, and as the water on my bristles touch the puddle of pigment, it's just going to pick a little bit up and you can distribute the rest of the pigment to create a flower petal one by one. For each flower, I like to add around 3 to 4 petals depending on how large you paint them. And I also try my best to leave some space in between the petals so we can layer on more once everything is dry. Each petal is quite wet. That is why it's also important to leave a little bit of space in between. If not, they're just going to become a giant clump. And while the surface is still damp, I also added a bit more of that blue. I'm just going to call it blue because it's much easier. And then I'm going to extend the flower downwards by creating some really thin lines. This is to suggest the sepals underneath using a very thick consistency and a really light brush load of Aquarius green. Just like how I sketched it out before, I try to vary the shape of the petals. Some of them are complete petals and some might not be. Some petals I might also paint with a weird bend, whereas others might be rounder or thinner. This keeps the flowers looking more organic than if we were to have all the same shape and size. You can also vary the angle, but I just kept mine simple and I just used the side view instead of the full frontal view of the flower. Here I didn't put enough of the darker tone, so I just extended a little bit of it for the center lines using the same mix before I added the green sepals. I just tried to randomly distribute the flowers and also play with the angle where they're facing. This is so the composition looks more flowy and loose. I'm just making another one here. This time I'm going to add 4 petals, but you can see that on the last petal that I'm going to make, it'll be very thin because of the lack of space, and it'll also suggest that we're looking at the petal from the side. For this one, you'll also see me picking up a thin consistency of the purple mix because I felt like the dark colors already dried up too much, so I'm just helping the distribution of paint on some of the petals if that's the case. This might also happen if you didn't place enough pigments at the center, in which case you can also extend the lines downwards after painting on the petals. Just be careful with how much pigment you pick up for these ones because sometimes it can be really difficult to create really thin consistency paint. As you can see on this one, I've also spread all of the dark purple at the center, in which case I'm just going to add it manually afterwards before adding the green sepals. For this flower here, I'm just going to make a small one compared to the ones I've painted so far. And as you can see, some of the petals are also looking unfinished since I didn't round the edges of the flowers. By the way, if you find it hard to paint using a thin consistency or it's hard to predict what color might be on your brush that you've picked up, feel free to swatch the paint on a scrap piece of paper first. When I first use watercolors, this is something that I would always do. It does take a lot of time, but the more experience you get, the more you'll be able to control it anyway. So try using the method that will suit your level best. Okay, so from here I'm just going to keep painting more flowers until I cover a good amount of the page. Then I'm going to dry everything off before layering some of the petals. I feel like I have enough flowers for now, so I'm just going to dry it off quickly with a hair dryer. By the way, if you're ever scared of smudging your flowers, you can also dry them off one by one with a hair dryer before painting the next flower. Sometimes we might forget and lean our hand on a wet painting, and that can be very frustrating, so just be mindful of it. Moving on to the layers, I'm just going to use a really thin consistency of the same mix. It's okay if some mixtures have more blue or a bit more red. I actually love the subtle variety, and I'm going to place some of the petals in between the ones that I've already painted so you can see the pretty overlapped areas. Sometimes I like to also add more petals on the side or some random thin ones for added variety. Again, be careful to not pick up too much paint because if the additional petals look too dark, they might look a bit too out of place. You just want to make sure that the layer underneath is still visible. Sometimes it's also okay to not paint on all of the gaps because those small white areas in between of the petals actually help the flowers look more delicate, as you can see in some of these areas. Sometimes if you accidentally place too dark of a color, you can lift in the color by using a clean dry brush while the surface is still damp, so your dry brush can absorb the extra paint. Or you can also paint a few sections of a petal, then just add more water without any paint to help distribute the paint you've already placed on the petal, which is what I try to do here. Here's another example. I've painted the left and right side of the petal, then I just use water for the rest of the space to pick up the excess pigment that I've already placed. This is actually very helpful in order for you to control the light consistency. After I've added on the layers for all the flowers, I felt like the composition doesn't look as light as I wanted to anymore. So for some variation and also to lighten the composition, I'm going to add a couple of small flowers without the layers so they stay nice and light compared to the layered ones. And I'm just going to use the same method as the first layer. Once I've added a couple of flowers, I'm going to make sure they're completely dry before I add on the stems. Okay, so for the stems, I'm just going to use a very thick consistency of the green that it almost looked black. And I'm also going to use a very light brush load so my bristles come to a very fine point and you can't really see any puddles forming on the tip. This makes it very easy for you to control the brush. And if you accidentally pick up too much paint, you can dab off the excess using tissue. This is why it's super important to always have either a paper towel or tissue right next to you. It's actually as important as all of your other supplies. I personally wouldn't paint without it. It's also easier to use a dry brush load when you're using thick consistency because the paint should just be wet enough to be activated and picked up by your brush. You can actually feel the thickness of the paint when you're using a thick consistency. Here I tried to make the petals look truly transparent by adding a light consistency of the green mixed with a bit of purple, so it looks like the stem is behind the flower. But I think it will look too messy and busy if I do that to all the flowers, so I just left this idea after painting this one. This additional detail kind of doesn't make sense, but I feel like it will enhance the flowers. So I just added some lines for the darker areas with some added dots using a thick consistency of the purple mix. This is something that you would usually see at the center of the flower, but I decided to just paint it on for extra detail. When I'm painting this, again, I use a thick consistency and a dry brush load to make the lines look more delicate, and I can also apply it much easier. Now lastly, for the leaves, I'm going to just use the Aquarius green as is. I just like how muted the color is, so it looks natural, and I'm using a medium consistency here to paint some long leaves. And I tried to also make them look like they have slight folds, or some of them are thinner so they look like it's seen from the side. I realized they would look way better if they're painted a little bit lighter and for some to have a thinner consistency, but I didn't realize this at the moment since I've only painted a little bit. Then after a while I felt like the leaves just ended up making the painting look too heavy for my liking, but I'm going to show you how I'm going to fix it later on. To paint the leaves, I also left out a little bit of a white negative space in between. This makes the leaf look less dense, and it's also suggesting the midrib without us having to paint it on top. I tried to place them in between some of the flowers as well so they can interact with each other in the composition. This is actually when I realized the leaves look too heavy in comparison to the flowers, at least in my opinion. So I'm going to lift some of the colors by reactivating the colors of the leaves. I just use a clean damp brush. Then once I can see a bit of the pigments reacting with the water, I dab off the activated paint with tissue, or you can also pick up the excess paint with a clean dry brush. If you need to do this, be careful to not use part of your tissue which already absorbed some green, because you might end up stamping the green instead on your paper, creating a random stain. After doing this, I also realized that they look kind of flat, so I decided to add some light leaves using a really light consistency of the green to suggest some depth. And that's it for this painting. I really love these types of repetitive paintings which can be used as an exercise. By the way, be sure to check out the Skillshare class as well if you're interested. And if you're new here and you enjoyed this tutorial, please consider subscribing for more. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. Thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!